Well, thank you so much for joining us. Nice full room. That's excellent. We'll get straight into it. There's quite a bit to get through, so we won't belabor any points of who we are. Aside from we're both from Cisco. The obligatory disclaimer, we're both researchers, so if we're doing our jobs right, things we say should be worrying to our employers. So these are our views, not Cisco's views. Don't hold them accountable. So before we jump in, who here would consider themselves like security rather than identity? Who derives their daily wage from doing security? OK, smattering of hands. How many people from that group feel that they derive their revenue from being paid to attack things? Cool. No one is going to.
Attackers.
No one is going to say I'm wrong. That's excellent. So one of the things that I had in mind with this talk, like where it really was conceived, we're hearing Zero Trust more and more, Beyond Corp, and a lot of new acronyms and different ways that people are trying to kind of own the concept of Zero Trust. But what is Zero Trust? What does it do for us? Where is it useful? And where are its limitations? That seems to be a much harder question for people to answer. There's really, I would say, 3 points in the Zero Trust history that are worth kind of, at least for this audience, zooming in on. Zero Trust came from the Jericho Forum. Group of CTOs sitting in a room, smart folks, good ideas, very forward thinking. They released some papers, got a little bit of traction within the group that read the papers from the Jericho Forum. But beyond that, didn't really have much impact. Good forward-looking ideas, but not really changing anything. And then Google came along. There was Operation Aurora. I'm sure many people have heard different aspects of that. Nation-state attack against a private company. Google has resources that few other companies do, a lot of smart people. And they decided to take a lot of the ideas from the Jericho Forum, the Zero Trust ideas, and embody it in an implementation they called Beyond Corp. That took off. That got people to understand that these could be implemented at scale in the real world, that were beyond the paper. And then came this kind of rush afterwards of people trying to make money off of Beyond Corp. So if I'm trying to summarize Zero Trust in one slide, this would probably be the best thing that I can do. The perimeter is really hard to secure. One just doesn't simply secure it. And we've all heard the M&M analogy about the network. It's crunchy on the outside and it's soft in the middle. I actually prefer the popcorn analogy. I think this is a better analogy for the networks that we deal with today, the modern technology stack of networks. Because our networks are popped. They're inside out. You don't know where it extends to, and you can't predict how your network has kind of turned inside out. There's software as a service. There's a lot of third-party dependencies. You likely don't even run your own data centers anymore, or not the entirety of your tech stack on IAM. So if we're thinking about what is Zero Trust, what is it trying to achieve, Zero Trust, in a nutshell, is trying to secure the popcorn. We all have popcorn networks. Zero Trust is a way for us to try and modernize our way of thinking, remove the perimeter and that popcorn and M&M analogy, and take a new approach to how we can try and secure this kind of inside-out network that we find ourselves with. It might not be perfect or where we want it to get to, but it's where we're at, and that's what we need to deal with. So Morteza's going to take you through some core principles of Zero Trust about not the product, but like what's the genesis and the core principles that are actually valuable from the concepts.
OK. So once the popcorn is popped, we are sort of pretty much the industry is really looking at Zero Trust as the next model of looking at how do we secure that really sort of distorted and very numerous number of sort of parameters that we sort of ended up with. We're really not going to talk about it at detail, but some of the concepts, some of the more sort of relevant concept of Zero Trust is really important to sort of point out. And these are not product specific. This is really about the sort of the concepts of Zero Trust as opposed to individual products or approaches that one vendor might be taking it. One of the more fundamental ones is the fact that your trust underlying infrastructure is not as sort of the answer of getting in or not. For example, in the old days, you get into the VPN. Once you're in the VPN, you have access to all the resources. Maybe there is an authentication on some services, but fundamentally, the presence on a given network or a subnet gives you a certain amount of sort of trust. And that's one of the core pieces that's really changing. And being on a network, having a sort of a IP address, being in part of a virtual network, any segment of the network by itself is not sufficient for granting access. This is really about how do we sort of look at the overall access and not just the network. Network has a lot of signals. The infrastructure has a lot of signals that help us make a decision on the trustworthiness or whether we want to allow it or not, but it's not the sole sort of decision factor. And that's pretty fundamental to the Zero Trust. Another sort of very important aspects of it is the fact that no longer just authenticating the user and giving them sort of, once we know who they are, giving them access to a resource is sufficient. Devices are all kinds. There are all levels of trustworthiness built into the device. And as such, the authentication of the access device, along with the sort of the user that's using that device to access a given resource, is very critical into that decision making. And there is a lot of work that's being done in that space, and a lot of that is really need to roll into that sort of decision making for accessing the resource. Another one that's really, really critical is that we have been, for the most part, we've been really gotten used to the idea of sort of whether something is trusted or not, and then taking that notion of trusted in a really broad way in accessing resources. The zero trust is really sort of turning it around and look at the trustworthiness of a sort of equation, where we're looking at the trustworthiness of the user, trustworthiness of the device, and sort of the risk associated with the resource that you're trying to access, and based on a policy, make a decision holistically for that given sort of transaction, for that operation. Do I have enough trustworthiness between the user and the device? And once you compare it to a policy and the risk associated with that transaction, now you can make a decision on a trusted. And the other part that's really key here is the fact that it's dynamic. We really can't do, we've been doing it in a very static way. You authenticate to a service, you get a session for so many hours, so many days, so many weeks, months. And for duration of that, we no longer go back and look at the conditions that allowed that initial trust to be granted. Zero trust, again, one of the fundamental pieces of it is the fact that it's dynamic. You really are breaking down and going to smaller and smaller sets of sort of transactions and doing it in a dynamic way, because trusted idea for one transaction might not be the same for another transaction, depending on the risk and the policies that you have in that system. Oh, another really important point is that the trust is not given, it's built. You sort of build up the trust as more signals of the trustworthiness comes into the system, and you sort of build up that or lower it or increase it, again, for a given transaction at a given time. Another fundamental difference is for the most part, most of the security products that we've been using and we've been deploying in our infrastructure have really been threat-centric. Zero trust is really about access-centric. It's instead of sort of saying I'm going to allow most things and then go look inside the infrastructure, the network, everything else, and try to detect that there's a bad transaction, a bad sort of actor is coming in and doing something. It really looks at it and says, I'm not going to give access to anything, so kind of go with the least privilege model, but I will look carefully at each access and make a decision at that access whether I grant it or I deny it. And that again, that's another sort of one of those fundamental pieces of it. I'm not used to not getting questions. It's like, this is going really fast. And this is my favorite, actually, sort of somewhat even touches the previous topic. We've done amazingly well in the authentication, in the identity. I've been in the identity space since sort of LDAP v2 days, and over the last 2 decades, we've come a long way in standardizing various aspects of authentication and identity management. We got into a pretty good place. We have federation, we have OAuth, we have a lot of the different pieces to kind of deal with that authentication problem. Unfortunately, when it comes into the authorization piece, we really haven't gone as far. As a matter of fact, I was actually looking at my slides. I gave a talk at CIS, which was the old version of Identiverse, in 2012, with the topic being sort of how low we've done in the industry as a sort of in the authorization space as a whole. And there's a lot more work that's needed. One of the key parts is we haven't really sort of managed to get the authorization to really fine-grain or transactional basis. The authorizations are generally done, if you look at sort of OAuth, for example. We do authorization at the sort of at the session sort of initiation time, and then we leave it alone. We don't really have the ability to sort of dynamically change it and update it based on the transactions you're performing. as we get the authorization to go from very, very large authorization, you log in, I make a decision on your authorization, and sort of, that remains statically for the life of that session. As we're getting closer and closer to the point that we get to the transactional-based authorization, one of the things that happens is scale and performance becomes more critical, and the fact that it needs to be distributed. So some of the key things that really come into play as you deploy Zero Trust is consistency, performance, and interoperability becomes so much more important, because if you're distributing your authorization, the actual enforcement of that authorization, you really need to make sure that all the signals that the authorization endpoint is making sort of a decision on is the same as another sort of, one, so that you get that consistency. And that's relatively a complicated problem. And the other part of it that we haven't really sort of, solved is when you jumping across administrative boundaries, security administrative boundaries. We really have no way of essentially federating or dealing with authorization once you cross administrative boundaries, which again, that's one of the challenges that we're dealing with today. Hopefully, as an industry, we can really make some progress on this one. And the other one that's really worth mentioning, a lot of vendors really are talking about Zero Trust as a product. And we really don't see it as a single product. This is just a different way of doing security. This is a model. This is not a single product. So it's an ecosystem. It's going to be multiple products from multiple vendors that really roll into to sort of give you the semantics of Zero Trust. And as such, we really need to focus on some aspects of that and not just focus on one product or one vendor for that solution. This is the best quote that I've seen. Jared Benson from CISO of Coke Industries sort of summed it up the best that I've seen so far. It really, I mean, you can read it for yourself, but it really describes the world that we're living in. And the reason why Zero Trust is becoming one of the sort of fundamental ways of doing the security, because the sort of the old way of doing security from the 90s really is no longer sufficient for taking care of sort of the problem. So not really looking at the actual number, whether it's 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, we totally believe this is going to be the best practice. Zero Trust is not this fancy sort of thing that I want to hang my products off of it. This is really the way we're going to do security. And as we get to that sort of world of this is the best practice, it doesn't mean that the bad guys are going to sort of just pack up their stuff and go home, right? So the question is, what is it that they're going to be doing? And Rich is going to be talking through that a little bit.
So if we got to the point that we're 5 years in the future or 7 years in the future, and we're in this blissful Zero Trust utopia, everything is Zero Trust, does that mean I pack up my bags and go home? Do I have nothing left to do? Well, no. It just means that the cheese has moved, and I will evolve, and I will adapt, and I will target different things to try and meet my aims, whatever those aims would be if I was an adversary. So I run Duo Labs, and one of the kind of concepts that we use during our research is the concept of attack-driven defense. As a group, we are pretty heavy in the offense side. We've kind of, we've built up our chops breaking in, red teaming, pen testing, exploit development, vulnerability discovery, exploit framework and attack framework, exfil. All of our backgrounds are in how to circumvent all of the controls that have been put in our place. We use that knowledge to try and build that better mousetrap. And one of the ways that I try and explain kind of how I conceive of the life cycle of attack is, if the clicker works, is these kind of landscapes. And I deliberately use the word landscape because it's abstract. It's general. So if we, as a collective group, we define the technology landscape, we are the people that are building, tomorrow's world. Well, as an attacker, I'm going to look at what you're building out, and I'm going to see how I can abuse that. What are the things that I can misuse from your good intent that will get me the advantage that I'm looking for? So the technology landscape comes out with some new things. It's constantly evolving. That drives the threat landscape to evolve. The means and the method that I am going to use to compromise the system will evolve as the tech landscape evolves. Then there's obviously the response. I'm doing, I've developed a new attack, or it's become public. I speak about it at Black Hat, whatever it may be. And then everyone's like, oh my God, we need to respond to that. And so you'll get the solution landscape, and people will respond to the particular attack or approach that the scene has developed. The solution landscape could probably also be called the security industry. That would probably be fair, but let's keep it abstract. And then from that solution landscape, there's probably two pathways back into the tech landscape. There's either the kind of point solution. Everybody's using the same approaches to try and end run the attackers. It tends to be technical and very specific in nature, but it just becomes so general that it's not really a product anymore. Like everybody's adopting that technique. It's just a way to kind of lock out the attackers. Or we take the better approach, which is often slower, that we actually embody in the technology landscape the lessons that we've learned. What did we get wrong? How were we able to be taken advantage of? And then we embody that back into the technology landscape. That's the best case scenario. It's maybe not the most frequent, and it's certainly slower. And then we're back at square one. Well, cool. There's a new tech landscape. I spend my time sitting down, working my ways around that. And we go around and around and around, and that's the cat and mouse game that we all know so well of security. But I think something that's really important to take away, and certainly for folks in this room who are the ones defining the technology landscape, if you were defining the tech landscape, you were implicitly defining the threat landscape. As an attacker, I cannot define the threat landscape. It is given to me. I exist in that world. You defined that. Don't ignore it. Use it to your advantage. If you are defining the technology landscape, it is within your power to predict, and I would say it is incumbent upon you to predict how the threat landscape will evolve to your new technology landscape. So with this as our mental model, and with the precursor that Morteza explained about some of the principles of zero trust, if we were in this utopia, everything's zero trusted, but we're in this life cycle, what does that mean to me as an attacker? How is that going to change my tactics? Very short talk today, so I wouldn't say that this is an exhaustive list, but I would say it's probably a representative list. So first off, what does zero trust make harder for me? Like, how does it make my life harder if I'm trying to compromise systems and you've gone all out on your zero trust model? Number one thing, like, value of stolen credentials really diminishes. Right now, if I can get someone's username and password, or if they're using Duo or some other MFA provider, that gets harder, it raises the bar. But if I can get credentials, which you can in a variety of ways, game's over. Zero trust has a prerequisite of strong authentication. It's kind of already saying, authentication solved, authorization is really what we need to be working on. And as Morteza said, we've done a great job in authentication. We've done a less great job in authorization. So credentials decrease in value. Also, it's much harder for me to laterally move around a network. Right now, if I'm able to phish somebody, or I'm able to get presence on an endpoint through a variety of mechanisms, I'm inside the popcorn. Then I can just go wild. There's normally very few barriers internally, or the barriers that are there are not complete enough, and I will find the Raspberry Pi that's sitting on the network, and then I can pivot through that. A lot of the low-hanging fruit as well. Morteza spoke to that the device is being seen as just as important as the user now for granting access. Is the user trustworthy? Is the device trustworthy? Do they have permission to access the resource that they've requested? Well, inevitably, that's going to force kind of an increase in the hygiene of devices. If people can't access the resource because they're out of date, that stick will beat them, so they update. Again, for me as an attacker, it's removing a lot of the low-hanging fruit. Really, all of those top points really come down to my ability to do indiscriminate attacks, or the value I get back from indiscriminate attacks, really, really diminishes. Right now, you can kind of do a drive-by style. I'll get somebody, and then from there, I'll work out to get towards the thing that I care about. And this last point is really, really, really the important one in terms of like, what does zero trust actually give you? What zero trust does, it forces me as an attacker to be far more targeted in my attack. I can't cast a wide net anymore. I've got to be specific, and I need to align my target and my outcome and work towards that. It requires a lot more upfront work from me. It requires likely a lot higher skill level of your adversary. You're pushing that skill level up. As soon as you're pushing skill level up, there's more of me as an attacker that's going into that attack. As soon as more of me there, it's more attributable. If it's more attributable, now I'm going to be definitely double checking that I've got everything right before I drop the bomb or do what I'm doing there. All of this is really coming towards the fact that it's increasing the cost of me as an attacker. It increases my costs. Whatever technology, whether it's zero trust or any other security technology that you're deploying, if you can't affirmatively say you've increased the cost to the attacker, it's probably not providing you the value that you want it to. Increase my cost. That is how you're going to win the game. So if that's all the thing that makes it harder, where am I going to move to now? I'm not going to go home. I'm not going to pack up and be like, oh, you got zero trust. All right, I'm going to go find a new job. No, I'm just going to find new things to look at. And there's still plenty of them. Zero trust definitely raises the bar. It makes my life harder, but it doesn't make it impossible. The most obvious thing that I'm going to target first is what happens after you've authenticated and authorized. In a majority of systems, you'll be issued a bearer token, a session cookie, or some other artifact of, cool, we checked you, and you're good for time period X. X could be minutes, but it could also be months. And often it is statically defined and very, very long-lived. So for me as an attacker, if I can possess the bearer token, I've kind of bypassed a lot of the front door issues. So bearer token possession, or from the perspective of the defender, protecting those bearer tokens becomes critical. Things like people leaking API keys into GitHub, very, very real. I can trawl GitHub with a variety of easy to find or custom written scripts and just pull down a lot of credentials. If you're doing a pen test or a red team, starting from an internet position, it's one of the first things you will do. Trawl somebody's GitHub or trawl an organization's GitHub, see which developers inadvertently leaked what, or that they've shared their dot files in their personal GitHub, snarf them, and I'm probably at least one point of presence further along in my chain of attack. So bearer tokens, definitely don't forget about them just because you've secured the front door. The APIs themselves. Everything is becoming API-driven now, but not everything is API first. So this means that we're applying APIs to maybe more legacy systems, or multiple different APIs. Oh, it had a XML, it had a SOAP API, but now we've got a RESTful one. As an attacker, I'm going to look at what is your presentation layer, what is your user interaction layer, and then how does that map to the privileges and expectations of the APIs. Those APIs, different ways of presenting that API, may actually give me different degrees of freedom to work through a system. You can play APIs against each other, so they're not always parallel. There's also, like technical debt and legacy code, and just old or development systems that are on the net that I will use. And if we're moving into a zero trust world, that zero trust world is inevitably API driven as well. And this ecosystem of things that creates zero trust needs to communicate with each other. So I'm going to focus on bugs and flaws in the new code that will be enforcing and delivering zero trust, because that code will be less well tested. We've alluded to it a lot through this talk. There's a control plane. Finally, zero trust is allowing us to separate the data plane and the control plane. Like the internet's finally caught up with telecom. The control plane is a huge, huge strength of zero trust, but also from an attacker's perspective, it's a huge target. Like if I can compromise the control plane, why do I want to compromise one firewall and change its config so I can do what I need to do? I can compromise the control plane and compromise all firewalls. So the protection of the control plane becomes critical. The security of your control plane really does equate to the security of the entire system that you've built around those ZT contexts. And as we're continuing to barrel towards the cloud, there's a lot of kind of AAS out there. Infrastructure, platform, software, all of these things which I'm kind of pushing away the control to somebody else. And that's great, but it doesn't mean that they're not running on computers. Serverless, I think, is a big misnomer. It's like saying takeaway is kitchenless. Kitchen was involved, just not my kitchen. So just because you're outsourcing and pushing away the cloud doesn't mean that now you're magically secure from everything. There's still infrastructure running that. There's a lot of interesting conversation around Meltdown and Spectre when people who were living in the cloud realized, oh, actually, an underlying core hardware deficiency is affecting my cloud. As has probably been discussed at length through today and the other days of Identiverse, there's all of these authentication and authorization protocols that are trying to make things better. But they often are very complicated and can be misconfigured or implemented in ways that were unintended. As an attacker, I will focus on finding those misconfigurations. There's been a lot of focus on kind of OAuth 2 and OIDC misconfigurations. A lot of them have been public. Good examples from from big kind of social network providers where they got something slightly wrong and that led to a lot of leverage. So I'm going to focus in on that. And in a corollary to the, it's just going to be my target of today. I'm just going to evolve my tactics. It doesn't We kick the can, and Zero Trust definitely raises the bar. This isn't intended to be kind of a nihilistic slide of like, oh, it's doom and gloom, don't try. Totally, I believe that Zero Trust will make things significantly more secure. But let's understand that it's not going to be the end game, and it's just going to evolve the way in which your systems are going to be attacked. So understanding the extent and the limitations of what you're implementing for security is half the game. Knowing what it won't cover is actually probably more important than what it will. Being very mindful of that, and don't buy into anything which is selling you Zero Trust in a box and it will take all of your worries away and the attackers will pack up and go home. Because I fundamentally disagree with that. So to wrap up, back to Mr. Morteza.
We're out of time, so I'll make this very quick. I already sort of talked about some of these things. Interoperability is absolutely key, which means that we need sort of, more work across the industry. We really need more collaboration around between the vendors and the customers. Over the last decade, we've done a lot of pretty good foundational sort of standards set, sort of, CAPE, WebAuthn. By the way, there's a talk on CAPE on Thursday at 2 p.m., if I'm not mistaken, you might want to go to. So there's a lot of work that's been done, but there's more needs to be done. And the other one, sort of my pet peeve, is distributed auth across administrative boundaries that I really feel we really need to get to doing it. And the other part is what's missing. You tell us, right? Let's work together on figuring some of this stuff.